Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time today. My name is Kyle Lepper, the current board president for AIA Washington Council and a member of the AIA Washington Council Interior Design Task Force. So we've been working for the past 10 months with AIA Washington members, having been working with the consortium of interior design Washington on the legislation they're planning to introduce in 2026 section. This would create a registered commercial interior designer designation in Washington State. Our AIA Washington task force includes representatives from all our chapters statewide, ensuring we have a perspective from across the state. I know some of you probably are wondering why we are even at this table, and the simple answer is that we need to be in the conversation. The Interior Design Coalition came to us with the legislation ready for 2025 session. They could have moved forward without us. Instead, they all agreed to delay to 2026 so we could work together. That means that we have a seat at the table and a voice in shaping this legislation. This isn't a new idea. It's been an issue for AIA for a long time. However, the landscape has shifted significantly. AIA National has changed their position on interior design legislation and has decided to remain neutral on the issue. NCARB has also shifted their position, and many other states have passed their own versions of interior design legislation in recent years, including North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Nebraska. And many others are working through a process similar to ours. This is happening nationwide, and we're largely navigating it on our own. Our task force has operated with one guiding principle throughout the process: the protection of the health, safety, and welfare of the public. It's the foundation of RCW 18.08, and it's the responsibility we carry as architects. When the task force began this work, we recognized that none of us in the Washington or AIA Washington side are experts in the education, experience, and examination requirements of interior designers. So we agreed to use the forthcoming I-Core report as our foundation. The Inter-Organizational Council for Regulation represents 5 related disciplines. That is architecture, interior design, landscape architecture, engineering, and surveying. And they've been working to clarify the overlap and boundaries between our professions. That report, it was supposed to help guide our work, particularly on ensuring that the registration requirements for the registered commercial interior design aligns appropriately with the licensure requirements for architects. Unfortunately, the report has been delayed until early December. Without it, we don't have the confidence that the bill language will reflect I-Core's findings on where the professional boundaries should be drawn. Our colleagues from the Interior Design Coalition agreed with us, which is why we're here, or this is why we're pausing our work on the bill legislation until that report is available. Our internal group debated whether we should host these town halls ahead of that I-Core report release, but we decided that it was best to update membership on the work up until this point. We need your input, your questions, your concerns, so we can address them all moving forward. We understand that people may have strong feelings and opinions about this. I'm asking that we all approach this conversation with professionalism. Over these 10 months, we've had substantive, sometimes challenging conversations with colleagues and from the Interior Design Coalition, and they've been conducted in good faith on all sides. Our interior design colleagues have been generous with their time and expertise, and they're here with us today to walk you through the details of this proposal. So let's hear what they have to share, and we'll open up to questions at the end. So today we have Stacy Krumbacher and Megan Only to give us a presentation on their proposed legislation.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle. I really appreciate the rundown. I had that written in my scope here, but I'm glad you gave us that information. So I think Stacy, you're going to share the presentation that you all were shared as well, and we shared the draft V3 language as well for you all to consume before. But if you haven't checked that out, we kind of just wanted to give a shout out that it is in the link that you registered under. So it's a great read. But yes, we're here as the Consortium for Interior Design Washington. This is a joint effort we wanted to highlight between IIDA Northern Pacific Chapter and ASID Washington. So we have a lot of entities that are involved in this nationally and statewide. And then Stacy, I think if you want to hit the next, we've got our intro slides. So I'm a senior interior designer at Integris Architecture in Spokane, Washington. Stacy Krumbacher is an associate principal at Malum in Seattle, and she is also the International IIDA International Board President. I don't know if I said that I was the IIDA Northern Pacific Chapter President currently right now, and I don't believe our lobbyist is on the line. I didn't see him because I was admitting everyone, but Michael Transu is our lobbyist who has been involved in the task force as well. So for legislative questions, we've leaned into him and AIA's lobbyist as well. We can hit the next one. So again, today we're here to recognize interior design to be legislated and for commercial interior designers within our state, within the scope that they have defined within their bill language. And next, we will look at today why legal recognition matters for professions, not only interior design. This is pretty much for every regulated profession, if you will, but these ones are directed towards interior designers. So the public safety of the public to ensure that health, safety, welfare is met and that these professionals working in those code impacted environments are tested to do so. The professional clarity, this would provide scope boundaries that are defined for commercial interior designers. And this would then be set around the non-structural, non-seismic interior construction of buildings. And then this also, just to highlight, provides opportunities for commercial interior designers in the marketplace to be more open to choice for the public. And then today I'll dive into our agenda here. We're going to get through this pretty quick so we can get onto our town hall. You can see that's number 4 on our list, but we'll dive into the practice of commercial interior design, look at the national regulatory landscape that we've discussed in our task force, just so we all have that shared context. And then we'll look at the proposed scope language for Washington State that we sent you all. And I'll pass it to Stacy now.
Right. I will tee us off to really help articulate what we mean when we're talking about the practice of commercial interior design. And we tend to start this with a conversation about actually what qualifies a profession. Interior design is on that pathway of professionalization. There's typically 6 key markers that we look for when we identify a distinct profession from another. The first is a specialized body of knowledge, right? So there's a theory and practice that can be teachable. That usually comes through formal education and distinct qualification. So there's a structured curriculum that has some form of accreditation, there's experience, and there's a requirement for demonstrated competence for those practitioners. This kind of gets grouped around a professional culture and identity so that there are shared values and norms and commitment to that profession as an identity. This is all underpinned when we think about profession with being rooted in a commitment to protect public interest, right? So this idea of ethics and service orientation, when we think about how that profession shows up to serve the larger community, there is an element of authority and autonomy that an individual profession and professional can exercise judgment and hold accountability for outcomes with that. And then it is all sanctioned, right, through regulatory acts. So that idea, there's legal recognition and an institutional authority to really set and enforce those standards of practice. And we'll kind of come back to this idea as we think about, as we see how interior designers have evolved as a profession itself. This is your very mini interior design history lesson. The early 1900s saw the emergence of interior design or interior decoration really as a profession. It was very much centered on domestic work and linked to the cult of domesticity for any of those that remember their architectural history. Really, decorator started to become very much at this time linked to the idea of superficial application, very much not seen as a technical kind of scope of practice at that time. It was pretty informal at the turn of the century, often tied to social connections. It was very much a gendered labor practice. It was one of the first professions that was deemed acceptable for women to move into as they stepped out of the home and into professional life. It was very much seen as a feminized component when we start to think about what that is. Now, as we move towards the middle of the 20th century, the practice really started to expand into more commercial settings outside of residential. We see a language shift from interior decorator to interior designer that really comes forward after World War II and in the 1960s. And this was intended to signal a more competency from a technical, functional, and human-centered experience when we look at how interior designers are practicing at that time. Our education and organizations really began to be defined kind of through these 50s and 60s, and we defined interior design very much in a problem-solving, code-based application. This started to give the field standards of knowledge, ethics, and an understanding of professional competency that we really continued to build forward into the latter half of the 20th century, and now we're seeing flourish today. So the push for regulation really stepped into that in the 80s. You start to see states beginning to explore what regulation looks like and really tying that recognition back to the health, safety, welfare impact. Education continues to advance in its technical depth kind of over these last 30 to 40 years, and the organization really strengthened the rigor of our education experience and examination through this pursuit of licensure and recognition. We start to see title and limited practice acts be passed kind of across the United States as we really were looking to seek parity with other allied licensed professionals so that we too would have a license when we all came to collaborate around the design table. Mapping this out kind of through this history of timeline, I put this in context with AIA and NCARB in the lower left. So you see here that same pathway to professionalization paralleled through the architectural disciplines as we see within the interiors disciplines. And Alabama actually was our first state to pass an Interior Design Title Act back in 1982. And today we have 31 jurisdictions, 29 of those states, as well as DC and Puerto Rico, that have some form of regulatory guidance around the practice of interior design. This timeline really helps us see this stepway to professionalization where we establish that practice and purpose, we build those knowledge and institutions, defined that competency and accountability, and then that last step is really securing legal recognition when we see it kind of mapped out along that effort of time. When we start to think about the language of interior design, we're relying heavily on CIDQ, which is the Council of Interior Design Qualifications. They're the testing body that accredits interior designers and how they have defined practice as it relates to the test that we use as the foundation for our regulatory acts. This is really focused in on interior non-structural, non-seismic construction and alteration projects. When we start to try to define, again, this idea of what's a big scope of practice and really creating clear areas where we understand overlap to be okay with the profession of architecture, and then where we start to find distinct boundaries to what that scope of practice looks like. Now, language is a tricky one when we talk about interior design because it is a profession that is often challenged by both public perception and industry perception of what practice is. So I tend to think of interior design as a broad spectrum. There are many practitioners who use the title interior designer, and they fall along a continuum of practice. So on the left-hand side here, you really see decorative interiors where there's a focus on aesthetics, very limited construction or code responsibility. The interior designers in this group may lack of formal credentials, and there are no title restrictions often in the broad term interior design, and they are often collaborating with other licensed professionals on technical aspects. The center component is our non-structural, non-seismic interiors. This is really what the basis of the CIDQ model law and the model law that we started our language from, which talks about interior spaces that are being modified independent of the structure. So, right, like we wouldn't be impacting a shear wall, but we may be doing a spatial arrangement of an office suite as an example. That work should still be code compliant, and depending on the state that you are within, you may have the legal right to independently practice that, or you may still be practicing that with an architect colleague. This is recommended or is the root of what our accredited education and NCAA certification is grounded in. Now, to the right, you shift into the language that we're starting to introduce around structural seismic interiors. And this is where you may have an interior designer working within a larger architectural practice. Their work may be impacting whole building systems, including structural modifications. It requires a permit, collaboration with architects. That code compliant work is led by the licensed architects in this case, although you still may have an interior designer that is NCIDQ certified and holds an accredited background. This we see as the boundary of what would independent practice look like when we're starting to look at what this law regulates and what this law prohibits from a practice perspective. We'll come back to this language throughout, but just trying to set up this question of, well, what do we mean by non-structural, non-seismic interiors?
And now looking a little bit deeper into those 3 E's. So we have the education E, which would be the education of an interior designer through university, but it is an accredited degree program. So CEDA, the Council for Interior Design Accreditation, similarly to NAB that accredits architecture schools. So this establishes the standards that universities are meeting. And so on that right-hand side, there's a lot of text, but highlighting points that the students are being taught: construction, product science, materiality science, environmental sustainability, code regulations and guidelines. Those are all things that are rooted in the education of a CEDA accredited program. Then moving on to the next E, we've got examination. So that's our NCIDQ administered by the CIDQ. So we have all of our acronyms as well. And to note, this exam is third-party tested alongside the same third-party reviewer as the CLARB exams, so the landscape architecture exams. And they have been proven to showcase that we are tested on the public health, safety, and welfare of our competency. And then we'll move on to the next E, which is experience. So combining the first 2 E's, education and examination, you also have experiential hours. As in architecture, you have to work underneath an NCIDQ certified interior designer or licensed architect. And you have to have a certain amount of hours within each one of these buckets that you can see on the left-hand side that then equates to whether you went to a CEDA accredited university or if you have an architecture degree. So different pathways to certification there. And then the next one, we've got our continuing education for interior designers. So as in other professions that are regulated, CIDQ requires us to submit our health, safety, welfare CEU credits. But as you can see in this example here, Texas is a regulated state and they require 12 CEU credits that are health, safety, welfare. And that's actually more stringent than the NCIDQ requirement. So we can move to the next one, which Stacy will get into national regulatory landscape.
All right, so a little bit, I've had the privilege of being involved in some of our national efforts when we start to see what's happening across the country. So I want to share a snippet of what is happening. That does start us in this question of what is occupational regulation. Essentially, it is that there is an approval for being listed as qualified or licensed to perform certain tasks or jobs. So essentially seeking to protect health, safety, and welfare impact to the public. We see three variations of occupational regulation happen in interiors, and there's a myriad of ones that fall between these, but the baseline regulation is a title act or registry. So this is typically a voluntary registry where essentially you are just protecting the title itself. Still comes with CEU requirements often, but it's really just trying to say this is the define a baseline level of practice for an associated title. Then we start to get into limited practice acts where there's a title component and then there's a right to stamp within a very explicit scope. So this typically is a voluntary registry that grants authority to those that do want to work within the scope of practice that is identified in the language. And that is that ability to practice independently. And then the third is a licensure or practice act, which is a right to practice. This is what most architectural acts are, where it is illegal for a person to practice a profession without meeting those state standards. So there's kind of different levels or degrees of variation when we start to think about how title is used and kind of what the scope of practice is that we are protecting. That steps us into, this is our map of North America, where you can start to see the varied types of legislation that do exist kind of across our community. So the dark teal here is a title act with permitting privileges. So that's that idea of a limited practice act, essentially, to say, in Illinois, as an interior designer, you would be voluntarily registering, and then you would be able to do work as it is defined within the legislation that Illinois creates. Because all politics are local, there is model language that helps to drive where states head. But much like we are on a path with collaboration with AIA, each state has individually gone through that collaborative path and built out language as it best supports their community and how their state understands the practice of interior design. So that has offered us a gift of some maybe inconsistency in how we look at it, although you can start to see in our more recent laws, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and North Carolina, a lot more similarities within the bill language as these pieces of language started to build on each other. And I believe Kyle also mentioned Pennsylvania earlier on our conversation today. So these are good indicators of kind of the direction that the practice is heading as we start to see what other states have been regulating. Building on that, model law has recently been published by CIDQ in order to help to address some of this inconsistency that we're starting to hear from lawmakers across the country in an effort to begin to align more states with more similar regulations. So this was issued back in June of 2024, and we are currently working on an aligned set of model rules and regulations that will actually supplement that and be published this year. So full acknowledgement here, I was part of developing this one as well, or at least part of the task force that had built this, and then how that began built on like the most recently regulated states that we saw. Pass it back over to Megan.
Yes, and so speaking on behalf of all of these states that have legislation, it didn't just happen overnight. It took a lot of collaboration, and really starting in 2021, it was the joint report that came out from NCARB and NCIDQ. They joined together and reviewed the exams through comparison, and they found that there was scope overlap of nearly 60% similarity. And then they also deemed that interior designers do have a health, safety, welfare impact to the public. So that was really pivotal in informing legislation in other states. And throughout the years, we've gotten to, I think you can hit the next slide, Stacy. Bam. Okay, so there's the report. There's the cover page. So this was really pivotal in North Carolina, particularly developing their language as this informed their scope boundaries as well. And then we can move to the next one. I think Kyle hit on this one a little bit. So ICOR, the Interorganizational Council for Regulation, this is the guidelines that are being led in a report by a task force by this committee. And it's inclusive of NCARB, CLARB, NECS for engineers, and CIDQ. And again, speaker acknowledgement, Stacy belongs to this. So what they're doing right now over the past couple years, I want to say it's not been a year, Stacy, it's been many years for you.
Oh, we started in 2021. Kind of this is the work that came out of the joint task force to look at the 2 tests. And really the roots of it sit back in like 2020.
Yes, so it's definitely been reviewed by many hands, many eyes, many organizations, and this December, we're hopeful to have this be released to us so that we can look at our scope boundaries that we have defined from model law and compare them so that AIA Washington can have that before we submit to the legislature. So that's kind of what we're waiting on here, is to see what those scope boundaries are between architecture and structure and in the next profession, and then of course interior design and architecture. So Stacy, I'll pass it along to you.
Okay. All right, so that steps us into, well, what are we trying to do here in Washington? So we're not going to read the bill language, but we're going to share a couple highlights out of it, and just give you a little background on the work that we have collaborated with AIA Washington on. So we have held 5 workshops as our task force group. So really starting back in January to both introduce the conversation, share context, and really identify kind of what we needed to have the conversation. We dove deep into those reports, invited experts from CIDQ and NCARB who helped participate in writing that test assessment to join us and be able to ask questions of them. We were able to review the scope of practice together a few times before we were actually put language in front of the task force back in July. And then since then, we've gone through 2 rounds of feedback and comments that have created our 3rd iteration, which we know we still have work to do on coming into alignment around, but we felt was important to kind of share with you all for your input as well, as we continue to step along the process together. One kind of like the big idea of what this legislation will do. First and foremost, it creates a voluntary registry for registered commercial interior designers. That would be the protected title that would be used, really to differentiate an interior designer practicing within this regulatory scope from an interior designer that is practicing in other areas along that spectrum that I spoke to earlier. It would allow for a stamp and submission of technical drawings for interior non-structural projects, and kind of what we define as an interior non-structural project has been defined within that language to really seek to create strong clarity around what the scope covers and what it does not. We've defined education, experience, and certification requirements for registered commercial interior designers. We've identified parallel continuing education, as well as a Washington state law exam, so that would parallel what is required of architects in our state. And we've also developed the idea of a scope attestation form that an interior designer would be required to submit. The intent of this is to alleviate some of the burden on the permitting department and to really clearly have the interior designer demarcate what their scope is and why their permit falls within that and does not need the stamp of a licensed architect. And so it's very clear when someone may be practicing outside their scope that can be rejected and dealt with through the appropriate regulatory groups. The language is also introducing or essentially shifting the State Board for Architects into the State Board for Architects and Registered Commercial Interior Designers. So we are proposing adding 2 positions to that board that would be held by interior designers and changing that composition to 9. So we wouldn't be taking any seats away. We've also been sharing this work with the State Board for Architects. We've met with them kind of 3 or 4 times over the last year, most recently just a couple weeks ago, where we actually reviewed the law language with them and were able to answer questions and have a conversation with them about their perspective of what this would bring to Washington. I'm not going to read all of the scope of practice, but we can come back to this through questions and answers. Broadly, the scope of practice does include work within a proposed or existing building. So could be partnering on a new project in collaboration with an architect, or it could be modifying an existing building. Does include layouts, understanding of egress requirements, and how occupants would be leaving within kind of the defined space that the interior designer is working on, and how that links into the larger egress system. It includes assessment and analysis of interior life safety and fire protection requirements, and starts to create a little bit of language around responsibilities for passive fire protections versus coordination of active fire protection systems with other licensed professionals. Focuses on material selection and application, all kind of rooting this in the impact to code, standards, regulations, and guidelines. So that's kind of the broad idea of how we've defined what the practice of commercial design is. With that definition, we have included boundaries around the practice to really create clear edges of what an interior designer can't do when we look at the practice of registered commercial interior design. The first and foremost is a change of building use to occupancy is not already allowed by the building, or an occupancy of a greater hazard. Changing the construction classification of a building, any impacts to the structural system. The building envelope is a very clear, distinct boundary, so any work with the envelope would be outside the interior's scope of practice. Engineering, so the language accounts for coordination with engineers, but prohibits the act of engineering. And this then where you start to see even trying to provide some distinction here around what are the boundaries of coordination? So here, I'll give the electrical example, right? The integration of central building infrastructure. So an interior designer wouldn't be responsible for coordinating the power coming in and the main switch gear, but they would be able to create distribution pathways through the building coming off of that main switch gear, and coordinate localized panels with an electrical engineer for the suite or area in the building that they are practicing in. So those are kind of some of the ways in which we've begun to find those edges. I think the other one that we're still working to refine is really the line of egress systems. So, when you shift from what is allowable within a space you're working in. So here we've really leaned into how do we use occupant load as a distinguisher, so that if the scope of practice is within the same occupant load or lower, that would be acceptable. And then if you needed to increase the occupant load, right, you're starting to put pressure on the egress system serving the whole building, and that's where you would really hit that boundary and need another level of licensed practitioner in order to finalize that work. Same here with fire protection of primary structural, with it being non-structural, non-seismic. This is another one of those boundaries that we see as a clear and distinct way to create some edges around what the scope of practice is. So what that's what we're hoping to see happen in the legislation, and what we've been really intentional about both within the interiors community and the architectural community is this isn't about limiting practice, or the intent is not to limit. It's really about recognizing qualified practitioners that are seeking to practice independently and allow for independent stamp through the permitting process. So this language wouldn't prevent anyone from calling themselves an interior designer. That language has been there's a case in Florida, actually, where it is now prohibited to protect the term interior designer. It is too common of a language, and so it's not something that can actually be protected individually, which is why you often see modifiers to the term interior designer on recent regulation. The intent is not to restrict anyone from practicing as they are currently allowed. It is not intended to limit residential design or affect architects regulated in RCW 1808. So the intent is not to say you must now become a registered commercial interior designer to do a tenant improvement. That's not an intent of how the law is written. It has exclusions to allow architects to still continue to practice to the full extent of their ability. And it doesn't require anyone to register or hire a registered interior designer for this scope of practice that we've been identifying. So trying to be really clear with what we're hoping to achieve in this, and then where we want to have distinct boundaries to what practice looks like. So with that kind of hyper compressed, although I know probably feels a little long for those that are sitting on the other side of it, we'd love to answer questions. Maybe I'll turn it back over to Kyle to see if there's anything else, Kyle, that you want to add before we dip into conversation.
No, I have nothing else to add. I'm looking forward to people's questions and comments.
Yeah. And we do really appreciate the time and space that you've offered us to share a little bit of what we're up to as well. Have very much appreciated the collaboration that we have felt on our side as the consortium as well. Okay.
So Stacy, I think I'm just going to start with one because it might not be clear to everybody. When you had your slide on the occupational regulations, you had those 3 different terms, and maybe you can tell what it is, which of those terms would apply to the law that you're currently discussing.
Yeah, so this would be, it is a limited practice act is how we are seeing the language framed. Sometimes at the edges, it can get a little blurry because we are not seeking to regulate others from practice and how they are currently practicing. That is why we tend to lean into the language of it as a limited practice act, as opposed to a full practice act where you're creating a far harder edge on other practitioners. And it does include a protected title as part of that limited practice act. So there would be a title and a limited practice act that focuses towards what the scope is that we've identified in the law language.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the only other thing I would want to make clear to everybody is that if this would in no way restrict architects, licensed architects, from doing the work they already do, but it would restrict architects from using the term registered interior designer. And so that is there is a path in the bill language that would essentially streamlines an architect to be able to do that. There's no exam, there's no anything that you have to go through. You just have to do that registration in order to use that title, but you do not need the title in order to do the work.
Yep. Thank you, Tammy. Good clarification there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be appropriate to, is there formatting for questions and comments, or just jump in?
Have at
Just
it.
jump right in, Dan.
I think
Have
you
at it.
first.
Yeah, raise your
Yeah.
hand and go for it.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm happy to jump in and start kind of kick this thing off. I'm excited to see this kind of moving forward, and excited to see the collaboration that's happened here. I think I'm particularly excited to see this legislation going forward, because I think it's good for architects to have well-defined partners to be able to be working with. I have experience. I'm currently an architect with Integris Architecture, larger firm here in Washington, but I practiced for 10 years in the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area, where there's multiple different languages around who is what and what is an interior designer, what does that look like. And my experience there in particular, those were small firms. I was working at a firm that was a 4-person firm. I was working at a 10-person firm. And the ability to partner. Oftentimes we were doing projects that would be classified, could be done by an interior designer. We were also doing projects where we were doing a larger building and we had an owner. We'd frequently have owners that would bring in people that they wanted to have as an interior designer for a project. And the varying levels of service that the owner provided and how that impacted me and my ability to work by having someone who was a non certified designer versus an actual certified designer. And particularly when he had someone who was not, they were great people and had great ideas, but were not frequently, they did not have the experience or training to be able to execute at a level that the owner needed. And so those oftentimes meant additional work was piled on me and my firm that we weren't being compensated for, that we had to pick up additional load because things were not well defined, because we did not have a clear definition of what that practice was, that we had to do additional work because we weren't able to rely on our partners in the same way, where the owner often brought in a qualified interior designer. We were able to clearly work together and collaborate on a project in a much more proactive way. So I'm excited to see this kind of move forward for that reason and be able to really get partners who are able to work together to execute on a project. And I don't see it as something that's limiting what myself is able to do, and it rather helps build up the profession and build up the practice of constructing the built environment in a good way together. So I'm excited to see that. I think one comment as reviewing the actual bill language, this might be getting a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's section 2A where you're defining what it does not include, particularly the one where it's talking about change of building use. Right now, the language speaks to particular code chapter in the International Building Code. I would recommend refining that to speak to the Washington State existing building code as opposed to International Building Code. And I would also recommend not limiting it to chapter 10. Yes, that is the current version of the Washington existing building code, but I think you want to give it some more flexibility. And I would just recommend saying you're not changing to something that's a greater hazard as defined by the Washington State existing building code, and allow the Washington State existing code and the code council to be the ones to define that term, and as opposed to referring to a particular table. I think that could set up things for limiting and problems for everybody into the future. So it's just one comment that I had after reviewing the bill language. I think overall the bill language looks very good and is well put together to help define those limits and understand where we can work together. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate both your comments and insights. That one has been a tricky one that we've been wrestling with, how to make sure people know that we're referencing a distinct piece
I'm sure,
without over limiting. So that we'll take another peek at that. So thank you. Sue?
Looking for the unmute. Yeah, I'm coming to this discussion after, let's see, 40 years of working with very, very well-versed interior designers. In fact, partner in the firm that I founded, one of our 4 partners was an interior designer. And she knew more about the codes related to the work that she was doing than most architects do. And that I have since then, I've taught 4 years at WSU in the professional practice class and authored a textbook for pro practice classes that meets both interior design and architecture accredited programs. So that's the background that I'm bringing to the conversation. We all know that not everybody who is a registered architect, as I am, can practice at the same level in terms of protecting health and safety, public health and safety. Everybody, after school, people drift off into specialties, and one of the basics of the ethics of both practices for both professions is do not practice above your knowledge level, right? And so an interior design professional knows what they know and knows what they don't know. An architect knows what they know and what they don't know and when they need to reach out. So that's something that we need to acknowledge internally. And then the other piece, when bringing this in front of a legislative body, I will tell you that legislators have told me that the discussions they hate the most are the ones about professional practice boundaries. They just would like to not be involved. So we need to be recognized that everybody we're talking to at the legislative level doesn't really want to listen to this. They want you to make it, they want us to make it easy for them to understand. And the other is I would press AIA, organization that I've been involved with for over 50 years, to be very open to this. I know there's some resistance. The very first architecture firm I worked for only 3 years, they called interior designers interior desecrators. And I went from there to a firm where we were working very closely with people, they were all women, who had studied and knew what they were talking about. So I've seen that whole gamut of attitudes, and I'd like to encourage the AIA to take a very positive attitude to figuring out how do we do this in a way that works for the profession, works for the public health and safety, works for both professions, and doesn't make the mistake that my mother told me the American Nursing Association made in the 1960s when they refused to recognize the expertise of the men coming back from Vietnam who had been essentially operating as paramedics, operating at a very high level in healthcare, and wanted a bridge into practicing what they knew how to do. And now we have doctors, we have MDs, we have ODs, we have ARNPs, and we have PAs. The PAs, that whole category came up out of that boundary dispute between nurses and the men coming out of Vietnam. And now the healthcare profession is all tied up in knots over little bitty tweaks to who can do what. I would like us to get past that and potentially even think about this as a path towards something that is, at some point is called interior architecture, because it really is it's operating at that level. And even if that doesn't become the term, think about it that way. Interior architecture is a specialty in itself. More people are killed I don't have a statistic for this. I'll just tell you though that I know of people who've been nearly killed by furniture in seismic events than building collapse. So interior designers need to know what they're doing, and good ones do. And so we just want to give a boost to the good ones so that they get recognized for their knowledge when they're practicing within their scope of knowledge. Sorry, that wasn't a question. I guess that was a speech. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Sue. We appreciate your support. Yeah.
I have some thoughts if I can jump in. Sue, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. And I actually wanted to be something called an interior architect when I was little, when I grew up, and I didn't realize that wasn't an actual thing, right? So now I am an architect. I've done a lot of work with NCARB and AIA over the years, particularly around licensing and my work as a licensing advisor. I was on the board meeting a couple weeks ago, kind of hearing about this as it was presented. And to me, this license sort of sounds like it would be a subset of architecture. Like it was mentioned in the NCARB review, about 80% of the interior design competencies and the NCARB competencies do overlap. And I know that NCARB has worked to review like the bare minimum competencies for protecting health, safety, and welfare of the public to the point where they're like, if we remove any more, then it's going to be dangerous. So I guess I'm not fully understanding why, instead of creating a new license, why not work to bridge the gap for interior designers for that final 20% of those competencies that NCARB identified and get licensed as an architect versus creating a new regulation?
I think Kat, I appreciate your question. I think this comes at the parallel of what is it to be a distinct profession, because there are practitioners that, want to focus at that 80% and aren't seeking that additional 20%. So I think as our work has become so much more specialized kind of over the last 150 years, I think that emergence of a distinct body of knowledge and profession has happened. And so there are interior designers that aren't seeking to be architects. And so I think that's the crux of it, because, I can say I've seen a lot of interior designers go down that path path in Washington in particular, because there is a pathway to take the AREs as you practice with or under a licensed architect. And I know designers that have been encouraged to do that in order to step into leadership roles, right? So there's pressure, I think, on this idea of, well, could you just be like us in order to have that level of accountability or for the work that you are creating? And so this is pushing back on that idea a little bit to say that it is a distinct scope of practice, and that yes, some do choose to become architects as well and practice a foot in both worlds, and there are others that are like, this is the world that I want to practice in, this is my distinct professional identity, and so that is where we are seeking that ability for them to have independent pathway to practice.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I think my fear with that would be is as architects, we take these AREs. I don't work with structural systems that heavily. I don't have the knowledge required, but I did have the minimum competency required, right, to hit that threshold, specifically to protect the health, safety, welfare, not to be a good architect. And so I think if we're asking to license a profession to also help protect the health, safety, welfare, because otherwise we wouldn't need to be licensed, right? That why would the state care? I guess it seems a little dangerous, or like we could get into a muddy gray area of, yes, I know that some people don't want to just be an architect, but I'm seeing it less as a title and more as like, these are the minimum thresholds to make sure the public is safe.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's an interesting concept too, because it kind of goes back to I think what Sue was saying about doctors, right? Like not everyone is a doctor, right? Nurses get their own license, register, or not RN. So you have your RN, you have your physician's assistant. Like there is a reason that we have these different classifications. And while I can appreciate that architecture and interior design are similar, I can also appreciate that they are different professions and they do different things, and people do want to be able to be recognized or be able to practice in the field that they chose, that they enjoy, right? Just like someone might not want to be a doctor, but they want to be an RN, a registered nurse, right? Like they're similar, they're both in the healthcare field, they're both protecting people, but they're still different. And that's someone who I started my career as an interior designer, and I chose to get licensed as an architect, to be honest, because I was sick of people asking me if I like picking out paint colors and curtains. So I was like, fine, y'all can shut up and I'll just do both. But I think part of me still is a little resentful that I had to do that just to get people to take me seriously, just to get people to acknowledge my knowledge and what I did know and what I am good at. And I have a lot of respect for Megan, because instead of doing that, she said, no, this is what I like, and I want to be able to get licensed in what I like. And I think that's in a lot of ways harder than what I chose to do, of just doing both and shutting people up that way. I don't know.
Thanks, Karen, for sharing your perspective. I know this one's it can be a complex where identity gets so tied into what how we see responsibility and accountability, and there's quite a bit of deep-seated bias, I think, in what an interior designer is, that can link way back to the gendering of the profession, right? And so there's still legacies of that, tangible and visible, for those that have been in the space for a long time. Yeah. Other questions, curiosities, wonders?
Well, I did drop something in the chat, which is that you reminded me of a good point, which is there are differences. And in teaching interior design students as well as architecture students, I was a little bit aware of what some of those differences are in the coursework and in the focus. And there are many hazards in the built environment, and interior designers do focus on a different group of those. Maybe there's that 80% overlap in the kinds of materials. And I'm sorry, I have a dog that wants to get in my lap. that are that can lead to harm for the public. And so if we were able to articulate to legislators why there is a difference, that may be useful, because that question will come up. I'd like to point out that from the libertarian side of me, and from the libertarian side of some in the legislature, there have been proposals to pull landscape architecture licensing. The WSU combines landscape architecture and interior design in the School of Design and Construction. And so we had conversations about what does that mean? Why, how does landscape architecture affect the public health, safety, and welfare? And it does. It certainly does in terms of stormwater and some of the other kinds of issues that can come up in the outside of the building environment. And so they have to justify their existence by what are those things that particularly focus in on public health, safety, and welfare. So what are the differences? What are the things that interior designers bring to the design team that are different than the other two professions that are in a related area of design?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Sue. And I think sometimes this is where we struggle in the nuance of not trying to restrict the practice of architecture as well, right? In that, right, a building that meets code is your minimal viable product. Technically, if you meet the code, this is the worst building possible. It's not the best building because you're protecting people and you're just hitting the baseline, right? And so what can all professionals do to kind of get to what that minimum is? And then you start to see distinctions around kind of some of the quality of those aspects. So yes, likely an interior designer has far more education inputs that go into the slip resistance of tile, for instance. It's not a question I get very often from the architects in my office, although technically their competencies would say that they would be covered to understand flame spread on wall coverings on a wall, right, etc., that they could be specifying. And so there are pressures and how we start to distinguish what it is that we do, because our goal is not to push away the other profession and say, well, you're only going to regulate this bubble, right? That's why it's not a true License Practice Act that is fully prohibited, that says, well, architects can't do this thing. It is inclusive and held within the practice of architecture. And then that is where we start to get to that longer laundry list of kind of what does boundary look like as we start to try to define that piece of it. I know that's one that we continue to wrestle with. And in many ways, I don't know, for those that were around, probably 15, almost 20 years ago now was the last time Washington had put a pursuit out in front of the boards. And essentially, interior designers were pushed back by the legislators to say, your professions all need to figure it out, right? Both internal to interior design, because often we have kitchen and bath designers that don't want their practice infringed on, right? They are doing work that is outside that of code impacted environments at the moment, right? And we have the pressure of architecture, who was in staunch opposition at the time. So I think we get caught a little bit in this boomerang of how do we define that scope and also allow for other practices that are currently existing when we think about what we need to write into the language versus how we talk about it with the legislators as well, has definitely been something that we've been wrestling with. Yeah. I don't know, Megan, if you have anything else to add on to that one.
I think you covered it, but I saw Sue, you unmuted. Did you? Sorry.
20 years ago, I got to have an earful out of from Marianne about a whole thing. So one of the things that might be useful in both in shaping the bill and in selling the bill is looking at the whole interstate commerce. How do we help Washington residents who have a certain body of knowledge from an accredited programs? What is in that accredited program scope that they bring to the table, and how can the state of Washington support those people and then providing services really nationally and internationally? Because we have people based here do practice quite broadly. And so consistency with other jurisdictions and looking to what is that accredited program offer so that the state of Washington is in essence supporting economic development. That's usually a good approach, and it would make sense as well for practitioners to be able to work across state lines.
And it does, for context, there are about 840 interior designers that would be qualified for this when you look at the register, like who is registered, who has taken and passed the NCADQ successfully. It's not to say that all would register, but we have talked a little about from an economic case, there is a downturn in the number of registered architects right now. So this could be another way to see some of that registration dollars go back into the system as well, when we look at qualifying another profession to practice in an adjacent scope of practice. So as one thing, we've not quantified what the cost impact could be, but that's at least the scale of the people that could be impacted.
I didn't really have a question, but I just wanted to thank you both, Megan and Stacy, because I think this was super informative, and I think there's been a lot of misinformation out there potentially on what you guys are trying to achieve here, and so I think laying it out this way for all of us has been super helpful, and I personally support what you guys are trying to do, and I think it will be helpful for all architects to have those boundaries clearly defined and let you guys do what you're already doing, right? It's just, I don't know, regulating that a little bit more, making it more clear for all of us and understanding that better within the whole profession. So thank you.
Thanks, Kayla.
I know that this is not the small firm town hall, and I work at MG2. It's a larger firm, but I have been curious about what impacts you think this will have on the smaller architecture firms, because I know that there are plenty of firms out there, and I've worked for them before, that most of their work is remodel, not necessarily structural or sometimes minorly structural. And it seems like this language offers a pathway to basically cut the architects out of some of that work. So can you share a little bit, I guess, about what your thoughts on how that would impact the small firms?
Yeah, astute question. I mean, I think, this does create more opportunity in the market, right? So you are introducing practitioners that could be competing with some of the small firms. I think when we work on this from a regulation perspective, at least, where you try to ground it in, like, what is it to understand competencies of practice. So it's less about the market impacts to that, although it would create more consumer choice for some of these smaller scale projects that fall within this scope of practice, where there might be more competition for small firms. So that is where we do tend to have a more challenging conversation at the small firm roundtables, because it is the question of, are we trying to protect market scope, right, or market space, or because in some ways, right, the regulation is going to expand that market space for those that are practicing in smaller scale projects. So it will have some impact. Hard to know if that has been, I don't know of any states that have measured it from before or after yet, which was something I was curious about trying to do. But yeah, that might be one question.
I think what's kind of interesting about that argument too is, well, twofold, right? Like there are most small scale projects, you don't need a license in either to complete the work anyways. I don't remember the exact stats, but in California, at least, it used to be like single family residential, or single story residential, and then commercial, like below a certain square footage, or yeah. So I think that's interesting. But then the other part of that is, like, to say, I understand that some people don't want interior designers to be licensed because they don't want additional competition. And I'm not saying that was your point, Kat, but I get that that is a concern of people's. That would, and in my mind, it's like saying, well, we're not going to let any more undergrad students take the licensure exams because we don't want any more competition in the marketplace, right? Like, in my mind, whether or not a person is able to get licensed is not determined on whether or not we want more competition, right? Like, you can't say, no, you can't take your licensure exams because we're already oversaturated. So I get that people have that concern, but it kind of feels like a little bit selfish. Like, oh, you can't get licensed because I don't want more competition. Well, that's not really up for an individual to decide. You know, it's are you qualified? Do you have the proper education? Do you have the skills? If you have the skills, then who am I to tell you no?
I think I'll speak I mentioned it a little bit earlier, and my personal, it's anecdotal, but I know my personal experience working in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area, where we had very different laws regarding this. I know that in my experience, particularly at a very small firm, I found that having those registered professionals within that interior design scope really helped our practice. It helped our practice in both defining our contracts with our owners that we were working with, and also helped us particularly if it's find partners to be able to pursue work or to go after certain clients and things like that, and to be able to demonstrate competency as partners. We're still today, almost every project has some level of partnership. It's maybe not interior designer who I'm bringing on a mechanical engineer, I'm bringing on a structural engineer. There's always professional partnerships that are happening, and having a well-defined professional partnership, I guess even more so at a smaller firm than where I'm at now at a larger firm. We have a lot of disciplines in-house and are able to already know who we're bringing to the table. But at a small firm, having a well-defined partnership, I found to be a huge advantage. And I think that is something that would enhance the practice of architecture to have better defined here in Washington.
Thanks for both those perspectives.
Has there been any discussion with like the engineers about all this? I mean, I don't know if they care, to be honest with you. I'm just thinking about, the people that we do involve in our projects, right? And like,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Could I answer that one too? Because I will say Integris is an interesting firm because we do have principals that are structural engineers. So we do have in-house engineers, and then NAC Architecture, they have in-house electrical engineers. So there are firms that do have cross collaboration and partnership. And I will say for myself as an interior designer, I respect all the professions and get to work with them all under one roof, which is really fortunate. But a lot of them are very alarmed that we do not have regulation. They find it to be very odd and don't understand it, quite frankly. So I would say from the people I have spoken to personally, like Dan was saying, anecdotal, it has been a positive thing, what we're trying to do. So Stacy, I don't know if you have a national landscape opinion.
Yeah, happy to share. So I know Megan briefly mentioned it, but I have been deep in all those I-Corps chats. And so we have been collaboratively meeting for years now. The steering committee, which is representative of all the industries, it's really fascinating, right? How much pressure exists in interiors architecture, landscape and civil, architectural and structural, right? Like everybody has incidental practice. And the ways in which the states deal with it, it's like the Wild West, right? I mean, and even Karen, your point earlier, like if a project is less than 4,000 square feet, anyone can go in there right now in Washington. So there is like this lack of clarity, I think, that everybody coming together, at least at that national table, was excited to say, okay, like how can we get real clear with what does it mean? And, even talking to the electrical engineer counterpart on the steering committee, he's like, well, okay, well, what would I coordinate with an interior designer versus what would I expect to coordinate only with an architect? And that's where we were trying to tease out this question of, well, I probably wouldn't locate the main switchgear with an interior designer, but I'm sure as heck going to move a bunch of electrical panels around right within a space, right? And trying to find, or at least good edges, while keeping it broad enough to allow for evolutions in practice to change over time, but also like have some clear distinction, has been a welcome conversation, at least. We have not talked to colleagues in Washington around engineering. It did come up for anyone that wasn't on the state board call. One of the state board representatives had brought up, well, I was on a project where an engineer essentially hired an interior designer and they moved the whole project through permitting, or were trying to, essentially using the engineer stamp for the architectural building, and then the interiors was laying it out, right? And so they were able to stop that project through a different review process. But the intent is not to, the intent of this law language is not to allow for that, right? It's not to cut one profession out in favor of another. We even tried to illuminate in the law, like it is a registered commercial interior designer's requirement to identify to an owner when they have hit their scope boundary. Like, for instance, you're doing a cafe and they want to put a new window in, that would include modifying the envelope. An interior designer wouldn't actually be qualified to coordinate that on behalf of the owner. They would have to say, hold on, stop. We need to bring in another partner into the project in order to take on that scope of work because it falls outside of my scope of practice. That, Sue, to your point, relies on everyone at the table knowing clearly what their scope of practice is, which is where I think spelling it out can add to that level of clarity for us all as a community to build better patterns around what's okay and what's not okay to practice in. Sorry, that was a long-winded circular answer, but maybe that was my soapbox. Their wonders, curiosities.
I have one.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead, Veronica.
Work when it's on your head. I was just gonna ask, and I know, well, most of you know me on this call know that I'm on the task force on the AIA side, but I hold both certification in interior design and licensure in architecture in Washington State. And so I kind of wear these both hats, but have been on the AIA side. Anyway, that was just a little background on me. But basically, I'm asking what is the next step from the town halls? Because I know you have the small business owners one. Also, IDA is hosting one, which I also plan on attending. I might poke into small business owners just for fun. You know, where is that going? Are we going to have sort of a share out of how that went? Because as you can see, while we had really great attendance from Integris, there's not a lot of other people attending this. And I was kind of surprised. I even pinged my own office and was like, where are we at, folks? You know, like, do you read your emails from AIA? But, you know, no offense to those people. I love them. But yeah, so I'm kind of wondering, you know, how we share this out and how this combo went and maybe how the board meeting went. I'm on the side, you know, texting my region leader, Erica Lloyd, which we all know is on the board. But, you know, she didn't want to attend the town hall so as to be more neutral and respectful of her board position. So, yeah, but I am like, hey, you know, here's how the town hall is going, of course, to her. But yeah, anyway, that was a weird question, but I think you can find the answer in there, Stacy.
Yeah, yeah. Great question. I mean, I think we too were a little surprised at attendance. I don't know, Tammy, if you want to add
I
into
was
this as
shocked.
well.
Yeah, I was really
Yeah.
shocked. And as you can imagine, I'm used to getting hate mail, which I do get, you know, depending on the subject that I happen to be emailing somebody about. And I got my fair share of people who are, you know, upset that we're even having this conversation. But I did get also quite a few people who were, you know, in the same camp as you, Sulani, who feel like they're, you know, this is definitely a good and right step for, you know, the design professions to be taking. But I'm surprised at how many people are. I appreciate that Integris has this kind of interest and is bringing this many people, but we really, we thought we were going to get a lot more people who were going to come in and have, you know, some issues to vent. And we just aren't seeing that. I'm not even seeing that in the small firm one. The small firm one attendance is going to be significantly smaller than this, which is a concern. So we are recording these. So after both of them are over, in fact, probably after today's and we get access to it, I'm going to put this on our YouTube channel and I'll give people the chance to go and watch this on their own. Yeah, that's kind of, I'll leave it to you guys for actual next steps in the whole process. But that's just me sharing my surprise at attendance as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, because we really want to welcome the conversation, right? We want to have it now, not on the hill, around like what tweaks do we need to continue to make? Because it's tricky to know, right? Does a lack of attendance in the town hall mean that people are overall on board, like this is the way the direction's going and we're all thumbs up, or does it mean a lack of awareness of the conversation happening? And then we would then maybe feel more blindsided later when it becomes more public in front of the legislators, which is what we're hoping not to see. We really want to come to a collaborative spot before we introduce the language. So worked out on that piece. We will get those posted and likely a summary of kind of key insights or shares out of the conversation that we will at least share to our task force members as well that aren't all on the calls. For the next steps from the longer process lane, the interior design community has been socializing our V3 with legislators as we look to finding a bill sponsor. We intend to create a version 4 that both takes into account comments made at this town hall, as well as continued feedback from both sides of our task force in kind of coming to a common language that we can all support. We are very much waiting for that ICOR report, rumored to come out in December to be sent to the member boards. So if that stays on course, we think that we are still on course to introduce language in the 2026 session. I think if ICOR doesn't come out, then we will revisit our timeline as a collaborative group to talk about what that may or may not mean to a 2026 pursuit. We think it's important to align to that national kind of like the only group that's tried to take on incidental practice scope overlap. And we know that it was quite a bite that they took off in trying to create this guidance document. So.
Hey guys, this is Michael, and I don't have a raised hand function, so my apologies for interjecting without raising my hand. I think to kind of tag on to what Stacy said, we'll get through through these town halls, take some input as we get through these town halls, and after those are done, we'll get something into the code revisor's office so that we can have a code revisor's draft pre-legislative session that folks can lean into as well.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
The nuts and bolts of process. Mm-hmm. If anyone ever told me I was going to write a law when I was in design school, I was going to be like, what?
I know.
All the fun stuff. So. Well, we do really appreciate everyone's time today, at least on behalf of the Interior Design Consortium, and I'll let Tammy or Kyle close out the official meeting, but we appreciate you showing up and sharing your voice and perspective, asking us good questions, and overall sharing your perspective on where we're headed.
And I would just add, this isn't the end of the conversation. If you get a chance now that you have this feedback, you have this opportunity to hear a little bit more, and you go in and you read the document, you're welcome to email any of us, and we will get your questions answered as best we can. So don't feel like this is the end of the conversation by any means. And if you're interested in hearing what's going on, the questions and the conversation in the small firm version, just email me and I'll get you that link so that you can be at that one too. Kyle, if you have some parting thoughts outside of just thanking everybody.
I would just encourage everybody to ask around to your colleagues or your local AIA chapter to try to gain some more perspective from our membership. As you know, we've reached out to everybody to join this call, but so we want to try to hear from as many members as possible. Please report back anything you find, any comments or questions.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Megan and Stacy for putting themselves out here. This was not an easy thing to put on, knowing that you really didn't know what kind of firing squad you might be facing. So I really appreciate all of the collaboration that we've had, in addition to the courage to come and share this with a group of people that thankfully seem very supportive of the idea. So thanks to both of you. I know that this was not an easy one.
Thank you, Tammy. We bore our broad shoulders.
Yes,
but,
yes. We've had this conversation many times, and I feel like Stacy and I are now enjoying it. So thank you all.
There you go. Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much for being here.